Hi. Here in week 14, we continue our conversation of the Deuteronomistic history, and in particular, its description of the monarchy. This week, we actually complete the sections of the Deuteronomistic history that are devoted to the United Monarchy, which in Israel's memory, and for many contemporary people, is considered the golden age of Israel's history. So it's well spent time for us to think about how the biblical writer portrays this period and wants us to think about it. As you may have noticed in your forum post for last week, there are different ways of understanding how the Deuteronomistic historian portrays the kings. Many of you saw in quite different ways the way that David is presented, the way that Saul is presented, and how compelling those portraits are. You may be interested to know that there's actually a pretty big scholarly debate about this question as well. That is the question, is the Deuteronomistic history pro-monarchy or at least pro-Davidic monarchy? For a long time, the usual answer among scholars has been yes, of course. That is, that the Deuteronomistic history is incredibly pro-monarchy, and the usual text given for this is 2 Samuel 7. You remember 2 Samuel 7, right? About how when David was settled in his house and God had given him rest from his enemies, David proposed to build a temple. Through Nathan, God said, "No thanks, Dave, but thanks anyway. And in response, as a reward for what you've offered, I'm going to build you a house." Again, using this word house in different ways as a pun or as a double entendre, a double meaning. And so what this story is doing is explaining the basis of the promise given to David and the Davidic covenant. We look here, for example, in, verse 12. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, and he shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom. I will be like a father to him, and he shall be like a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I'll punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my covenant promise from him, which is what the Hebrew word hesed is really all about, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house, your kingdom, shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Many biblical scholars, those who believe that the Deuteronomistic history is pro-Davidic, see this as kind of a linchpin text for a pro-Israel or a pro-David reading of the Deuteronomistic history. Here they would suggest the Deuteronomistic historian is giving a pass for Davidic kings, or perhaps we might say diplomatic immunity. Sure, if the Davidic heir does something wrong, he'll get some punishment, but that's no reason to ever take the Davidic covenant away from the line. And therefore, this passage is seen as being kind of the mark and the seal of the pro-Davidic perspective of the Deuteronomistic history. It goes even further than that, because we can see in the text itself, as in other places, that several things have been linked together here. Not only do we have a Davidic dynasty that is its own house being lifted up, but we can already see intimations in this text that the Davidic dynasty will be linked with the city of Jerusalem, a particular place, with a particular institution within that city, the temple, and that all of them will be brought together under the understanding that they are divinely ordained. Knowing that the city of Jerusalem is also sometimes called Zion, based on the hill in which it is built, we can begin to understand why Davidic theology can also be thought of as royal ideology, but also as Zion theology. Collins has some description of this on pages 126 and 127 about how we're seeing in 2 Samuel 7 and in other places at least one example of this idea or this ideology, infusion of power assumptions that has something to say about kingship in the ancient world. We can see some of these same ideas in many of the royal psalms. So let's take a minute and look at Psalm 2 and Psalm 89. Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord. And we remember that when this is in all caps, that means Yahweh, and his anointed, which, as you know from having read 1 Samuel, is the description of a king, saying, "Let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. Yahweh has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree of Yahweh. He said to me," and this is understood in Psalm scholarship to be referring to the Davidic king, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Again, while I know this passage is reinterpreted in the New Testament as applied to Jesus, notice how in Psalm 2 is referring to the Davidic king, and it's echoing directly the language of 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant, which said in that promise with David that God will be his father and he will be God's son. "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession." Notice how this psalm is a good example of royal theology, of Davidic kingship theology, and of Zion theology, of an understanding that God's king sits upon his throne in Jerusalem at God's will. We can see this same idea expressed in Psalm 89, and I'm beginning my reading here somewhere around verse 19. "Then you spoke in a vision to your faithful one, and said, I set a crown on one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from my people. I have found my servant David. With my holy oil I have anointed him. My hand shall always remain with him. My arm shall also strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him, the wicked not humble him. I will crush his foes, strike down those who hate him. My faithfulness and steadfast love," again the Hebrew word hesed, which means faithfulness to a covenant, "will be with him, and my covenant with him shall stand firm. I will establish his line forever, and his throne as long as heavens endure. If his children forsake my law and do not walk according to my ordinances, then I will punish their transgressions with the rod. Then I will not remove from him my faithful covenant faithfulness, or be false to my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went from my lips. Once and for all I have sworn by my holiness," which, by the way, that's how God swears. God can't say by God, because God's God. So God says, "I swear by my own holiness that I will not lie to David. His line shall continue forever, and his throne endure before me like the sun." Perhaps you can see then why for many scholars, as well as many readers of the Bible, the passage of 2 Samuel 7 is kind of a no-brainer, telling us that clearly the Deuteronomistic historian, in giving us this account of the Davidic covenant, is clearly pro-Davidic monarchy, believing that kingship will never be taken away from the Davidic line. However, there is another viewpoint, and that is that the Deuteronomistic historian might know about these pro-Davidic ideas, but is actually attempting to curb them. You may remember that reading from last week, in which Collins, on pages 124 and 125, explains how he believes that the Psalms show us that the ideas were already out there, and what that the Deuteronomistic history is trying to do is actually to curb the powers of the king. Other people have extended this idea by pointing out that in the Deuteronomistic history, in the books of Samuel, that even the king is subject to the require to obey that is the Deuteronomistic law. While in many cultures the kings have a divine right to do anything they want to, in the Deuteronomistic history, even the Davidic king is subject to the commands of the Deuteronomistic understanding of God's will. And therefore, many would argue that the Deuteronomistic history is not really pro-monarchy, but instead pro-obedience. Another key text for deciding about how the Deuteronomistic historian portrays the Davidic monarchy is again some passages that we read from last week. A big chunk of materials that runs from 2 Kings 9 into 2 Samuel 9 into 1 Kings 2 that tell us the stories of Bathsheba, the stories of Amnon, Tamar, Absalom, the death of Absalom, and that end with David on his deathbed giving instructions to Solomon, his successor, about how to get rid of his enemies. What is the point of this story? Is it to show that God can work with David in spite of his flaws? That is actually a redemption of David's story? Or, as some people have suggested, is this very a satirical, scathing portrait of the kind of depravity of the king, of the system of kingship, and the whole royal family? What is the point of the Deuteronomistic historian as it portrays kings? Perhaps you can sympathize with the viewpoint of our theological Bible commentary author on Samuel, Patricia Tull, when she said that at least the books of Samuel beckon no simplistic formulas, easy pronouncements, and they demand full recognition of the many-sided nature of human existence before a God whose plans intersect but by no means coincide with their own. That is, I think Tull and others would say, who knows with the Deuteronomistic historian that it's all quite so messy. But what about the readings as we continue? After all, the Deuteronomistic history is a big chunk. It set us up in Joshua and Judges. We've moved through Samuel. What about the book of Kings? How does it add to our understanding of the Deuteronomistic historian's perspective? Now, it's actually very fair for us to pay a lot of attention to the books of Kings because, as Collins points out, and others agree, that the hands of the Deuteronomistic editors is more obvious in the books of Kings than even it was in Samuel. And you might want to show this to yourself. Can you find references to the things that are characteristically Deuteronomistic in the books of Kings? Can you see how that when anyone talks, they kind of speak in Deuteronomistic language? That the hand of the Deuteronomistic author is fairly heavy in the telling of these stories. Kings not only gives us a very Deuteronomistic set of languages, but it also gives us the last king of the United Monarchy, Solomon. Perhaps we could think about Solomon as it's portrayed in the Deuteronomistic history in terms of the good and the bad. That is, that the Deuteronomistic history loves many things about Solomon. It talks about his legendary wisdom, and centrally, as you'll understand from the previous discussion in 2 Samuel 7, it's actually Solomon who gives us the temple that is fused together with royal ideology, theology throughout the Deuteronomistic history.